In the spring of 1889, in the basement of Seattle's Pioneer Building, a construction foreman opened a storage room sealed for 3 years. Inside, he found something impossible. Not an empty chamber, but a fully furnished storefront. Wooden shelves, a cash register, everything covered in silt, like volcanic ash. The city records listed this space as sub-level storage, never occupied. Yet, here stood evidence of commercial activity. Frozen in time, deliberately buried beneath what was now the ground floor. The dates did not align. That same year, across North America, time 100 miscal, something unprecedented was happening. Seattle, Spokane, Vancouver, dozens of smaller towns, cities that had recently burned. The official narrative spoke of tragic fires followed by heroic reconstruction. Build better, build fireproof, build modern. Newspapers celebrated progress, publishing illustrations of grand new buildings rising from ashes like phoenixes. But beneath the rhetoric, something else was occurring. Cities were not being rebuilt at ground level. They were being built 1 story higher, leaving the previous street level to become a buried sub-level, a shadow city sealed beneath the new one. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental, the method too uniform across distant cities to be independent innovation, and the speed. The remarkable speed with which this transformation occurred suggested planning that predated the fires themselves. On June 6, 1889, witnesses described a fire in Seattle that began in a cabinet shop and consumed 64 acres in less than 12 hours. The flames moved with unusual intensity, fed by wooden buildings coated in turpentine and linseed oil. Newspaper accounts emphasized the dry weather, the strong wind, the unfortunate timing. What they mentioned only briefly, in paragraphs buried deep in the coverage, was that firefighters initially had no water pressure. The new gravity-based water system, installed just months earlier, failed at the precise moment it was needed. Hydrants produced only a trickle. By the time steam pumps arrived from neighboring towns, the fire had become unstoppable. A photograph taken the morning after shows 31 blocks reduced to ash and twisted metal. But the image reveals something else. The burned district sits in a shallow bowl, the original street level clearly lower than the surrounding neighborhoods that survived. Seattle had been built on tide flats. The lowest streets flooded twice daily with the tide. This inconvenient fact had been noted, time 400s, in city planning documents since 1870. Proposals to raise the street grade had been discussed repeatedly. The fire provided opportunity. Within 2 weeks, the city council passed an ordinance. All new construction in the burned district must use brick or stone, no exceptions, and the street level would be raised, in some areas by as much as 12 feet. Property owners who wished to rebuild had no choice but to comply. The old street level would become the new basement, but here, the official record begins to fracture. A surveyor's notebook from July 1889, discovered in the University of Washington, archives in 1974, contains measurements that contradict the public explanation. The new street grade was not consistent. In areas where the old streets were relatively high and well-drained, the raise was minimal, 2 or 3 feet. In areas already prone to flooding, the raise was extreme, 10, 12, even 15 feet in some blocks. If the purpose was drainage, the inconsistency makes no sense, unless the purpose was not drainage at all. The surveyor, Thomas Mercer, noted in the margin, "Grade follows property value, not hydrology." Curious. No explanation follows. Construction began with unusual coordination. Multiple buildings started simultaneously in late June. The new structures were built with ground floors at the new elevated street level, but the old storefronts, the ones that had existed before the fire, were not demolished. They were left largely intact. Retaining walls were constructed along the old sidewalks, creating a canyon between the old street level and the new. The space between was filled with sawdust, broken brick, and debris from the fire. As the filling rose, the old storefronts disappeared beneath it, becoming subterranean. For months, Seattle existed on 2 levels simultaneously. Pedestrians walked on wooden planks above the filling operation. Merchants continued operating their businesses below, accessed by temporary staircases. Gradually, as the fill reached completion, the businesses relocated to the new ground floor. The old entrances were sealed. The old streets became tunnels, lit by skylights of purple glass embedded in the new sidewalks above. A diary entry from October 1889, written by a shopkeeper named Mary Ann Conklin, describes the transition. Today we moved upstairs to the new store, everything bright and modern, but standing at the window, I can see through the glass bricks beneath my feet to the old shop below, still containing our abandoned fixtures, like looking down into a tomb we built for ourselves. Yet, the pattern was not unique to Seattle. In Spokane, Washington, a fire on August 4th, 1889, just 2 months after Seattle's disaster, consumed 32 blocks of the city center. The response was nearly identical. Brick-only building codes, street grade raised by 6 to 10 feet, the old street level buried and eventually sealed. The similarity in timing and method suggests communication between city planners, though no correspondence confirming this has been found in public archives. In Vancouver, British Columbia, the fire occurred on June 13, 1886, 3 years before the Seattle disaster. The entire city, then barely 2 months old, burned in less than an hour. Reconstruction followed the same pattern. New street grade elevated, old level buried. The official explanation cited improved drainage and fire prevention. But Vancouver's original town site was built on relatively high ground, well above the tide line. Drainage was not a significant problem. A surveyor's map from 1887, held in the Vancouver City Archives, shows the new street grid overlaid on the old. In the margin, someone has written, "Per instruction from CPR Land Office." The Canadian Pacific Railway, which owned much of the land, had specified the street grades, level moderate, before reconstruction began. The fire had not yet occurred when these specifications were drawn. This detail, a map showing post-fire street levels dated before the fire, has no explanation in the official record. By 1890, the pattern had spread to smaller towns: Ellensburg, Washington, New Westminster, British Columbia, Roslyn, Washington. Each suffered a major fire, each rebuilt with elevated streets and buried the old level. In some cases, the fires occurred with suspicious timing, often during economic downturns when insurance payouts would be particularly valuable, or during disputes over building codes and urban planning. In Ellensburg, a photographer named Nathaniel Stevens documented the reconstruction in a series of images taken between July 1889 and June 1890. The photographs show the methodical burial of the old city. In one image, dated November 1889, workers are pouring concrete retaining walls while storefronts below remain fully intact, their windows still displaying goods. The workers are building a tomb around functioning businesses. Stevens's personal notes express confusion. Why not demolish and rebuild from foundation? The method seems wasteful, leaving old structures to rot beneath new construction. Foreman claims it's cheaper than excavation, but the old buildings are sound. They survived the fire. The answer may lie in what was being buried. Not just old storefronts, but old records, old property lines, old claims. The fires provided an opportunity to reset urban geography, to redraw ownership maps, to erase competing claims to valuable land. By literally burying the past beneath a new present, cities could start fresh with new deeds, new surveys, new tax assessments. A ledger from the King County Assessor's Office, covering 1888 to 1891, shows a curious pattern. Properties in the burned district of Seattle lost their pre-fire assessment records. The column labeled "Previous Value" is blank for hundreds of parcels. The new assessments, calculated after reconstruction, were often significantly higher than pre-fire estimates. Property owners, desperate to rebuild, had no documentary evidence to challenge the new valuations. Insurance records tell a parallel story. Many of the Seattle buildings that burned were insured through San Francisco-based companies. Claims were processed quickly. Suspiciously quickly, some adjusters later noted. Policies paid out within weeks, allowing reconstruction to begin immediately. But the insurance maps, drawn before the fires, show many structures as high fire risk or inadequate for commercial use. After reconstruction, the same locations received fireproof ratings and premium reductions. The buried original structures, built of the same wood that burned so readily, remain beneath the new fireproof facades. The question becomes, if the buried structures were fire hazards, why leave them in place? Why not demolish completely and build on solid ground? The answer emerges from soil reports. In Seattle, several engineering surveys from 1890 to 1892 note that the fill material, the sawdust, ash, and debris used to raise the street level was compacting unevenly. Buildings were settling at different rates. Cracks appeared in walls. Foundations shifted. The buried wooden structures, acting as a kind of lattice within the fill, provided stabilization. They were structural support disguised as debris. In effect, the new fireproof cities were built on top of the old flammable ones, which continued to serve a hidden purpose even as their existence was officially erased. By 1893, the burial was largely complete in most affected cities. The underground levels were sealed, locked, forgotten. Maps were redrawn showing only the new street grid. New residents arriving after reconstruction, time 400s, had no knowledge of the sublevel. The cities presented themselves as modern, rational, planned. The buried past was not mentioned in promotional literature or guidebooks, but the underground did not remain empty. In Seattle, the tunnels found new uses. Opium dens operated in the sealed storefronts, accessible through hidden passages, gambling halls, brothels, speakeasies during Prohibition. The city above maintained its respectable facade, while vice operated literally beneath the surface. Police records from 1895 to 1910 contain numerous references to sublevel establishments, but addresses are often vague or coded. The underground had become unmappable. Time 600s, a shadow geography known only to those who used it. A police report from March 1907 describes a raid on an illegal gambling operation below street level, accessed through a trapdoor in the back room of a laundry on First Avenue. The report notes that the gambling hall occupied what appeared to be a former retail shop with intact shelving and a painted sign reading Palmer's Dry Goods, Est 1888. The establishment was operating in a space that officially did not exist, in a building that official records claimed was destroyed in the 1889 fire. Health department records from the same period note outbreaks of disease traced to sublevel dwellings, tuberculosis, pneumonia, typhoid. The underground, sealed from sunlight and fresh air, had become a reservoir for illness. Attempts to clear out the sublevel populations were sporadic and largely ineffective. The tunnels were too extensive, too labyrinthine. For every entrance that was sealed, 2 more were opened. By 1910, the official position was to pretend the underground did not exist. City maps showed no sublevel. Building permits made no mention of buried structures. The transformation was complete. The cities had rewritten their own histories, but physical evidence persisted. In 1965, a Seattle tour guide named Bill Speidel began offering underground tours, leading groups through a small section of the preserved tunnels. His tours revealed the buried storefronts, the purple glass skylights, the staircases that led down from modern buildings into Victorian-era streets. The tours became popular, forcing the city to acknowledge what it had spent decades denying. Speidel's research uncovered additional mysteries. He found evidence that some underground spaces had been used for purposes beyond commerce and vice. In one sealed chamber beneath Pioneer Square, he discovered a large room with acoustic tiles on the ceiling and walls, materials that did not exist in 1889. The tiles were stamped with a manufacturer's mark, dating to 1923. Someone had been maintaining and modifying these buried spaces decades after they were supposedly abandoned. Architectural historians examining the underground noted curious design features. Some buried storefronts had been modified with reinforced concrete and steel beams. Retrofitting that occurred well after the 1889 fire. Loading docks installed in the 1920s. Electrical wiring from the 1930s. The underground was not dead. It was being actively used, maintained, and expanded by someone who preferred to work in the buried city rather than the visible one above. Government records provided few answers. A Freedom of Information request filed in 1998, seeking documents related to sublevel municipal infrastructure in Seattle, 1890 to 1950, returned heavily redacted files. The readable portions mentioned utility maintenance, authorized access only, and restricted for public safety. What utilities required such secrecy? What accessed the buried level with official authorization while the city publicly denied its significance? Researchers found similar patterns in other cities with buried levels. In Spokane, a construction project in 2003 broke through into an underground tunnel system that extended for multiple blocks. The tunnels contained infrastructure that appeared to have been installed decades after the 1889 fire. Electrical conduits, telephone lines, steam pipes, all maintained and functional, with no official record of who maintained them or why. A city engineer working on the project, speaking anonymously to a local newspaper, stated, "These tunnels are mapped in blueprints we found in the archives, but the maps are classified. Someone knows about this network and has been using it for over a century. We were told to seal the breach and not ask questions." The question becomes, what purpose could buried streets serve that surface streets could not? Why would maintain hidden infrastructure when modern utilities could be installed above ground more easily and cheaply? One possibility emerges from examining what was buried, not just buildings, but entire commercial districts. Banks, assay offices, land title companies. In Seattle, the buried blocks included much of the financial district. Records, deeds, and contracts stored in these buildings would have been buried as well, even if the information had supposedly been transferred to new locations above ground. But paper records can exist in multiple forms. Copies can contradict. Duplicates can surface. By burying the original financial district, the city buried evidence. If a deed was disputed, the original could not be consulted. It was sealed beneath 12 feet of sawdust and concrete. New deeds, drawn after the fire, became the only valid records. The reset was total. Land title disputes in Seattle courts, 1890 to 1905, frequently ended with the phrase, "original records lost in fire or inaccessible." Plaintiffs who claimed ownership based on pre-fire documentation found themselves unable to prove their claims. The buried archives remained technically intact but legally inaccessible. This pattern appears in other buried cities as well. In each case, the fires preceded significant economic booms. Seattle's population quintupled between 1890 and 1900. Spokane doubled in size. Vancouver grew from a tent city to a major port. The fires, catastrophic as they appeared, preceded periods of intense prosperity. And in each case, the prosperity benefited a particular class of landowner. Those who held property after the reconstruction, not before. A historian examining Seattle's post-fire land transfers noted that over 60% of the burned district changed ownership between 1889 and 1891. The transfers were often recorded as sales, but the prices were well below market value. Original owners, facing immediate rebuilding costs and elevated property assessments, sold to investors who could afford to wait. By 1895, much of downtown Seattle was owned by a small group of investors, many of whom had arrived in the city only after the fire. The buried city, then, was not just a physical space but an economic mechanism. It allowed a complete reorganization of property ownership under the cover of disaster recovery. The old claims were buried with the old street level. The new owners built their fortunes literally on top of the erased past. Today, sections of Seattle's underground are preserved as historical curiosities. Tour groups descend staircases into the purple-lit tunnels, marveling at the Victorian storefronts frozen in time. The guides tell stories of the fire, the reconstruction, the colorful history of speakeasies and opium dens. But the tours avoid certain areas. Locked doors lead to tunnels that extend beyond the preserved sections. Signs read, "Authorized personnel only" and "Utility access restricted." In 2019, during construction of a new light rail tunnel, workers broke into a section of the underground that had been sealed since the 1890s. The chamber contained not a storefront, but what appeared to be an office. Desks, filing cabinets, a safe. The documents inside were removed by city officials before journalists could examine them. The official statement claimed the papers were water-damaged and historically insignificant. A construction worker who saw the documents before they were removed described them differently in an interview with a local blog. They were property deeds, dated 1888, not damaged at all. Someone had stored them deliberately in a fireproof safe in a sealed room. They wanted those deeds preserved but hidden. Makes you wonder what they proved. The breach was sealed within 48 hours. The light rail construction continued on a modified route that avoided the buried chamber. The pattern persists in other cities. In Spokane, restricted, tunnel sections remain off-limits despite public interest. In Vancouver, portions of the underground are occasionally discovered during construction. documented briefly, then sealed again. The official explanation is always public safety. Old structures are unstable, air quality is poor, access is dangerous, but the consistency of the response suggests another reason. The buried cities contain something that modern cities prefer to keep buried. Perhaps it is simply history. The evidence of how modern urban geography was created not through careful planning, but through catastrophic disruption and rapid consolidation. Or perhaps it is something more specific. Documents that contradict current property claims, evidence of fraud in the post-fire reconstruction, records of who actually owned the cities before they burned, and who owns them now. The fires of 1889 were declared accidents. The decision to bury the old street levels was called progress. The sealed tunnels were described as abandoned and forgotten. But in each case, the official story requires us to believe in remarkable coincidences, fires that occurred at economically opportune moments, reconstruction plans that were implemented with suspicious speed, infrastructure buried but somehow maintained for over a century, documents preserved in hidden chambers, then confiscated before they could be examined. If history is written by survivors, then the buried cities are the history that was written over, literally covered with new pavement and new stories. The purple glass skylight panels still embedded in Seattle's sidewalks allow fragments of light to reach the streets below, illuminating spaces that officially ceased to exist in 1889. On certain afternoons, when the sun hits the glass at the right angle, pedestrians walking above cast shadows into the buried world beneath their feet. The shadows move across storefronts that have been sealed for over a century, across signs advertising goods that have not been sold in lifetimes, times 600s, across doorways that lead to offices where deeds and contracts still sit in fireproof safes, waiting for someone with the right key and the wrong questions. The pattern continues. Modern cities built over buried ones, new stories constructed on sealed foundations. The past not destroyed but archived beneath the present, accessible only through locked doors and restricted passages, maintained by those who understand that some histories serve better when they remain underground.